Hello and welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest Hanson. If you're new to the podcast, thanks for listening today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. I'm joined today, as usual, by Dr. Rick Hanson. Dad, how are you doing today?
I'm good and psyched about our grab bag.
Yeah, I'm excited to be doing these too. We are opening up the mailbag and answering some questions from our listeners today. It's always great to do this. We get absolutely phenomenal questions from people. We have such an engaged audience. So again, thanks for just taking the time to send this in. And if you're somebody who did that, it can also be kind of a vulnerable experience. So I really appreciate people being willing to, even if it's anonymously, be a little dissected publicly in this way. And if you'd like to have a question answered on the podcast, the best way to do that is by signing up for our Patreon. It's patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. And you can also just shoot me an email if you want to. That's contact@beingwellpodcast.com. So let's just get right into this, Dad. Our first question here, and I think this is such an interesting question because it is such a common problem. I have a friend and coworker that I like a lot, but they seem to have negative commentary about everything. I try to be more positive, but I find myself joining in by midday. I don't like it, but I also don't want to damage the relationship by bringing it up. What can I do here?
First of all, there's the question for the person asking the question. What is uncomfortable about being around negative commentary? And also, what is it in you that draws you into joining it? And so both of those might be useful explorations for oneself, because in effect, if you can be okay in the middle of your friend's negative commentary, then it's not a problem. And also, if you could be around negative commentary without getting joining in with it or sucked into it, then that wouldn't be a problem either. So that's kind of off the top of my mind. Kind of more deeply, I found myself reflecting on friends of mine and who have deeply negative views about the world that, from my standpoint, are either wildly exaggerated or very partial. They really are zeroed in on, let's say, the bad, tragic, getting worse, alarming tiles in the mosaic of reality, but they're ignoring the rest. So let's say that's what's happening here. I find that you're right. Sometimes if you name it, it actually creates a turning point in the relationship that can be kind of awkward. So you want to be careful about that on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm wondering here about, wow, what's going on in the mind of someone who is quote unquote chronically negative? And to respond to that in some way that is skillful and caring, one opportunity is to really try to let the other person land inside. People who have a negative take about things are often used to complaining into thin air, and other people have turned the channel. They're not listening anymore. And so they keep it up because they don't really feel received. So one thing that's interesting is to really inquire and ask more, even at a deeper level. Questions like, wow, you're right about all that. How is it for you to be with all that? How does it make you feel? How do you want to feel about it? What's deep here for you? How do we live in a world in which we're born and we know inevitably we will die, often accompanied by some significant amount of pain, certainly the emotional pain of losing loved ones. We're leaving the show, right, before they are. How do we live in this life? So anyway, these are deeper questions that can sometimes dislodge somebody from their script. They have this sort of routine, their shtick of negativity, into a deeper inquiry of how does that actually feel? And how do you want to relate to whatever is actually true that you're talking about?
My suspicion here, and to kind of turn you toward a more superficial example here, Dad, there are people that I know who just complain a lot. They are complaining about their coworkers, they're complaining about the world, they're complaining about what the waiter brought them and how it wasn't quite what they wanted or what they ordered. They're just complainers. And there is also, I think, kind of broadly a culture of commentary on other people, like talking about people outside of the social group with a lot of judgment, with a lot of negativity, dismissiveness, put whatever word you want on it here. And I suspect that that's kind of what the questioner is highlighting, that relational tendency where you join with the person you're close to by complaining about or dissing essentially other things. And it's a really common tendency. And it's also one that historically has really kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I tend to not like that. I tend to be quite oppositional around negativity, as I've talked about a little bit on the podcast in the past. Maybe that's my Enneagram six-ishness coming through here a little. But it's a tricky thing to deal with when it comes up because you're right. You have a set of options where it feels like all of them are kind of complicated. On the one hand, you can name it to the other person. On the other hand, you could just get comfortable with it inside of yourself. Or you could try to do this third box that you're sort of indicating here, Dad, where you're joining with what's going on a layer down for them,
Yeah.
as opposed to joining with their more surface level communication.
Yeah. And maybe a fourth box. I like your categories here. I'm definitely a boxer. So, fourth one would be to, after maybe saying back to the person, what they're saying, like you get that they're upset, they were jilted on a recent date, or their boss is a maniac, or global warming is real. All of it. Okay. Yep. All real. And is there the freedom in the interaction or the relationship to ask other kinds of questions like, yeah, that part really sucks. Huh. What is going well in your life these days? What do you like doing these days? What are you enjoying these days? How are you growing these days? And just directing the conversation in that in that other way.
Yeah, I made a real commitment in my social groups years ago. And this was, I don't know if the people are interested in this kind of thing or not, but brief personal story. I dance as a significant hobby. Part of that dance community is a lot of sociality, a lot of like hanging out with other people in rooms at the hotels where these various events are. And people are just chronically negative in these rooms. So I've bumped into a lot of that, which is why I'm so interested in this question. And there's a lot of speaking ill of other people. There's a lot of complaining about their relative station, all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And these more socially loaded forms of negativity. And I made a total commitment. This was, I mean, almost a decade ago now, to essentially never say something bad about somebody who wasn't in the room, to just never do it, period, end of story. And to either nudge other people away from doing that kind of a thing or to actively support people who were not in the space. And that was that was like just a deep commitment that I had around it because I just hated that. Well, thank you. And it wasn't really even moralistic in nature. It was mostly about what did and didn't bug me. If that kind of makes sense, it just really bugged me. And other people noticed it over time. And in general, I've received a lot of positive feedback about it. And so I think that there are things you can do to position yourself as that kind of a person that do not actively bring you into conflict with your friend who is a bit of a complainer, right? You can do all the things you're describing here, Dad. You can turn toward the positive. You can try to put a different spin on it. You can try to move away from the topic. You can speak about it at the meta level. I think these are all really good ways to approach this.
Yeah, there's something so fundamental about curiosity about another person.
Yeah, why are they going there? Totally.
Exactly. So even without saying anything, you might ask yourself, what's the payoff for these people? What's the payoff? Why do they keep doing it? It focuses on things that are unpleasant. So it's it's a short hop from complaining about things to experiencing negative emotions of various kinds. Why would people be drawn to that? It must serve some important function. There must be some payoffs in it to put up with the costs of it. And that's curious. Also, then just asking the person natural questions, kind of disrupting the performative script-like ritualistic quality that often comes with regular complaining. It's almost, it's kind of a ritual. They sort of say the same things. They do the same things. It has the same timing. So inquiry, just questions, curiosity that are authentic, not like, oh man, why do you have your head so, screwed on wrong? But no, more like, whoa, wow, tell me more about that. Or what really bothered you the most about that? Or what do you wish they would do? Just questions like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting. If you know anything about Milton Erickson, this genius hypnotist, and one of Erickson's main methods, not his only method, is that he would merge with traffic. In other words, he would merge with the clients, the patients, point of view and way of looking at things. And then he would gradually start disrupting that traffic in very simple ways. He might have the person move or face the window or shift in their body, or he himself would start sharing things and saying things that would disrupt their narrative and their way of being. And just the disruption of it alone, including through, for example, curiosity that would pull people out of a kind of a script like performance sometimes. Just that curiosity alone is disruptive. And it can have a really big effect.
Yeah, I think you're raising something here that's actually really, really important, which is often when we go a layer down with people in the ways that you're describing, this inquiry that's like one layer down from
Yeah.
that surface thing that's happening, we can do it in a way that is quite critical or pushy or immediately going into conflict with them. Essentially
Yeah.
saying, hey, you do this thing, I don't want you to do it anymore. Some version of that that's maybe more skillfully presented. But you're describing a way to do that that's supportive of them, that doesn't feel as conflict driven, and that could maybe actually lead to a really useful inquiry for both people. And when I found in my life that I've been able to do with that with somebody, when I've been able to do that with a friend, almost always it's gone really well.
Mm.
Sometimes people are initially skeptical. Sometimes there can be a layer of defensiveness. This is really understandable in our culture where there is so little of that deeper inquiry often going on inside of relationship. But most of the time, if you just kind of shrug and go, hey, I'm just curious. I'm not trying to be weird about it. I'm just really authentically interested in this. And hey, if you don't want to talk about it, that's totally okay. A
Yeah.
lot of the time, people will be really receptive to that kind of movement.
Yeah. That's right. They'll feel your sincerity.
Yeah.
And we're underlining a couple of qualities to be aware of that, frankly, I think will relate to our next question that's coming
Mm,
around the bend. Um, Sincerity, resting in your own sincerity, your own authenticity. You're there in good faith. You're keeping in your mind on multiple things that are happening, and you've got multiple purposes and aims. But fundamentally, you're there in good faith. Also, curiosity, a genuine interest in another person. We often don't have the sense of being around other people who, A, are with us with positive regard. They're there sincerely and in good faith. They're not playing games. And also, we often don't have a lot of experience of being around people who are genuinely curious.
hmm
Past the first question, they ask a follow up question. They might even ask another follow up question on the follow up question. They're actually interested. And what is it like to be with someone who's actually interested in you?
mm,
Not in a prosecutorial way or some kind of therapeutic, inappropriate way, or they're just really interested. We like that. And so if we enter into relationships, even ones that seem challenging or kind of anxiety provoking, we can take refuge in our own sincerity and our own interest in other people. And that will increase the odds of things going well.
great. So, like you said, we do have another question that kind of dovetails with this a little bit. And here it is. I'm 27. I've never been in a romantic relationship, and I feel disconnected from my emotions. Therapy helped me recognize I had an emotionally unstable mother and learn to prioritize her emotions and cope through cognitive bypassing. I've been successful in my career, and I've made progress around these issues, but I still struggle to integrate this knowledge into meaningful behavioral change. And then here's the crux of it. I'm stuck in a pattern where progress seems to trigger my avoidance tendencies, especially in dating and forming genuine connections. How can I break free from this cycle of avoidance and actively engage in the process of overcoming these challenges?
I hope the person's listening. And the first thing I just want to say is I really wish you the best here. It's poignant. It's poignant and common in that,
Mm,
for example, as we want to get close to other people, and yet it's called approach avoidance. In other words, as we get closer, that can stir up expectations and fears from our history, like being invaded by an emotionally unstable mother. And so then, as we start to experience more and more of what we want, understandably, we start feeling increasingly threatened. And then we withdraw or avoid, which lowers the heat in the moment, but it also perpetuates us not getting what we really want. So it's a very
Mm.
common situation. Good news is this person is 27
Mm-hmm.
and you got a lot of life ahead of you. And now's the time, you're right, young adulthood still, kind of. You're not yet in early middle age, let's say. So there's hope. And you're very self aware. A lot of tremendous clarity here. And I am getting also that you, the questioner, have a certain amount of executive functions, have will.
Yeah,
You
for
can
sure.
see a problem and you can understand rationally that you need to take action and you can help yourself do that. So these are all super good pluses. So I'll say three things and then see what you think, Forrest. The first is generally getting connected to emotions whose foundation is body sensations would be really good. And that alone would not trigger the pattern that you learned in your relationship with your mother. So just becoming more in touch with yourself. Charlotte Silver's work about sensory awareness, Lee Lesser, one of her major successors, her work on sensory awareness. These are all things that can help you come home more and more to your body. Doing things in your body. One of the best things in the world for mind body connection is what has been a major semi professional and now serious hobby for you, Forrest, dancing. Any kind of whole body movement that's integrative and helps us feel more comfortable in who we are. So, dancing is a really good way to meet people. Also, other kinds of activities like yoga classes, rock climbing is good that way. Okay, second, with your self awareness, start looking really at okay, what are the dreaded experiences that you're trying to avoid by withdrawing in dating environments and stepping back and try to be really specific about them. Like, for example, is it that if you find yourself starting to like someone, is there the assumption that eventually, when they get to know you, they won't like you? So, better to cut it off before you invest too much. That would be one. Or maybe another, that if you become connected with other people, uh, they will start doing to you what your mother did and be overwhelming and not respect your boundaries and be invasive, maybe with a lot of demands on you. Ugh, maybe that's what you're concerned about. Or maybe that if you are uh, just yourself, you're that with your own needs and your own authentic self-expression, which sounds like it was bottled up and put away in your childhood, that if you're like that, you'll be punished in some way because probably your mom punished you in some ways, if only through withdrawal herself for having needs of your own. So try to pin down what the dreaded experience is and then find what would help you start to risk it systematically. We've written a lot of stuff about this, talked a lot about it. The trick is to look for very small steps you can take, resource yourself in various ways for the step to be successful. And when it is, internalize that experience and thus
Mm.
gradually push back
Mm-hmm.
the so called bars of your invisible cage. That would be second. And then third, I have some advice about dating and mating based on many years of observation. And I've come to see that there are three major factors in success in forming romantic relationships. Number one, clarity of intention. That's what we're talking about here. This is a person who is ambivalent, right? And the closer they get to what they want, the more that the other pole of the ambivalence gets stronger. And one of the nice little practices that I learned a long time ago, you can do it in two steps, where basically you bring something to mind that you want, and then in a semi meditative way, or for a few minutes or a dozen minutes, be aware of what's in the way outside you and inside you to getting what you want and surface it, experience it, and especially get a sense of releasing it with the exhalation. And you can release it out
Mm.
into the universe. If you're spiritually inclined, you could release it out into the great mystery, the divine, perhaps. You're releasing it out there. You might visualize putting it on a piece of paper on a little boat and dropping that boat into a mighty river, a boat the size of your hand that's going to go out to sea. Or I will literally visualize putting that stuff in a rocket ship that's going to go blast off and go into the sun and be just completely, completely disentangled of all its constituent atoms. All right. So you're releasing it. And then at a certain point, it'll feel like there's a space inside. So then you do the other side of the little meditation where you start visualizing that you are receiving from the world, receiving from within yourself, receiving from the infinite, whatever. You're receiving that which you want. At which point, often some new barriers, some new blocks will arise. Then you switch back into releasing with the exhalation. And then when it feels right again, finish with the inhalation of what you want to receive. That's a really good practice around clarifying your intention. So you're really there for it. The other two factors I've seen that are psychology. That's where interpersonal skills come in, emotional intelligence comes in, and marketing. You're out in the world and you're enabling people to appreciate you. And all of that boils down for me to an approach in dating in which you can let the game come to you. You can be aware of your own sincerity, your genuine goodwill for others, your interest in them. You're there to build them up. You're a caring, kind, highly intelligent, obviously, basically happy person. Let the game come to you. And
Mm,
for many, many people in the dating world, to be in the presence of someone who's not running a number on them, is not hungry, is not needy in the problematic sense, but is contained in themselves, is basically happy, is warm and interested. Wow, that is a very appealing person. And especially when you get past the first couple of minutes of just pure physical appearance, then you're
mhm.
past that and you're really with who is this person? And in that way, you can be a really appealing person. And it takes a lot less work than trying to go out there to get those people to like you.
Part of the question for me is about where in the process these avoidance tendencies are kicking in. Are they kicking in at the very, very, very top of the funnel? Is this about, I think about the idea of going to a place where I might bump into people that I'm interested in and that feels bad to me, so I don't want to do it?
Yeah.
Or is this kicking in more about the transition from if you have a friend that you're kind of into, making that next bid for some form of changing the relationship or investigating whether you guys want to change the relationship together? Maybe that's where the avoidance is kicking in.
Mm.
Or maybe the avoidance is kicking in after 2 weeks of dating and things are kind of going to a more real place, or 2 months of dating or 2 years of dating. Your mileage might vary, whatever it is for you as a person. And I think that question is actually really relevant here because each of those different points could surface a different set of issues that you're kind of speaking to here, Dad, that you could go through that sort of a process around. They speak to different kinds of dreaded experience. Are you just worried of looking awkward or looking like a fool or having people say no to you? That's more like a top of the funnel problem. Or is your concern more about having deeper levels of who you are be seen by another person, or feeling more vulnerable in relationship with somebody else as you come to connect with them and rely upon them more and more over time? And so that's kind of a side question here, almost for this person. Like, where do you tend to run into problems? Is this a top of the funnel problem or is it more of a bottom of the funnel problem?
That's very astute because that's a great way to identify what is it that that the person's trying to avoid. Yeah.
Totally. And one of the things that I've definitely seen for people is that these problems can feel very big and cloud like and diffuse.
Mm.
I have a problem with my avoidant tendencies. Well, that's great. It's great that you've been able to identify that, but that can look like a lot of different things for a lot of different people. And obviously in a format like this where you're just sending a question in to be answered, you can't really dig into all of that. And you might be very clear about this already. This is more of sort of a general point for people listening. To the more clarity that you can apply to whatever the problem is, and the more that you can work through that diffuse cloud to something very specific, the more effective you're going to be in dealing with the problem.
It's really funny what it feels like in situations, the distinction between I'm trying to make something happen here, contrasted to I'm letting the game come to me. That's a term in sports where uh, like in basketball, you let yourself be more in the flow of it all rather than feel like somehow you've got to, be the hero, the superhero, and make things happen every play.
Yeah.
And I've been reflecting on what that feels like in life, where you let the game come to you and you be that person that in a dating context, the game wants to come to, right? And there's something kind of easy about it. You're interested, you're kind, you're happy, you're relaxed, you're cool. Uh, that's a really good way to be.
That's great, Dad. And I think that that is a good place to leave that question for the moment, at least. And so moving on to question number 3, which again kind of gets to some related issues. What's the line between healthy connection and asking for help with something and codependency? I'm in a new relationship with somebody who has had issues with codependency in the past. And I know that I have a lot of desires myself to feel special and secure in relationships. I'm working on those tendencies, but there are also times when I feel like I need help and support, as anyone would. Am I allowed to express that? I'm struggling to balance meeting my own needs, asking for appropriate help, and not making somebody else do it all for me. I thought this was a really interesting question, Dad, because people often throw around psychological terminology like codependency quite lightly these days. So it might be helpful to start with just you framing what is codependency?
Well, the roots of that are in work on addiction. And it's the notion that in a family system, or it could be a friend relationship or a let's say a long-term relationship such as a marriage, let's say there's a person who's the alcoholic who's dependent upon that substance. And there can be some situations, kind of in the extreme, where uh, the partner who's not an alcoholic somehow enables the alcoholism of the alcoholic or the other kinds of drug use, and is in some ways dependent upon um, that person being troubled or impaired in that way. Uh, I think there's some usefulness, uh, but on the whole, I'm pretty leery of the whole notion of codependency because
Mm.
it kind of removes autonomy from the person who actually has the problem, and it often sets up people who are very loving and family members who are pulling their hair out. But someone standing back might say, "Oh, you're just colluding in their dependency. They've got to hit bottom first."
Everything you're saying is totally true, Dad. And most of the time these days, my experience is that when people say the word codependency, they normally mean the word enmeshed. They normally
Yeah.
mean like an overly connected, overly dependent upon each other. It's in there in the word codependency kind of relationship. So I think that's what this person is really speaking to more.
Yeah, and uh, so all that said, what I'm hearing essentially, kind of classic situation that we could generalize from too, where you have one person who uh, uh, probably values closeness and values closeness to some extent in which they're being cared for by other people, taken care of, help, support, uh, uh, and also to some extent feeding their emotional need, their hungry heart for social supplies, narcissistic supplies, such as feeling special and secure, reassuring, right? And then you have another person who could well want more distance in the relationship, doesn't need so much reassurance, and kind of gets tired of offering it. What do we do here? And I find this is an example of a really important relationship theme. I'm going to do a visual demonstration here in which you have person A and person B. And let's say for person A wants this, whatever this is. Okay. And they're okay within the range of that, but they want that. Then you have person B who wants something different and they're in the range of that. Okay. Do they overlap enough that they can find an accommodation with each other and a negotiation over time? For example, in the structure of pursuer distancer, which is a little bit of what's here, very often what the person wants or needs in terms of closeness or reassurance or help is fairly small. And if they would just make it clear No, from time to time, honestly, I could just use a hug. I'm not going to become an emotional vampire. I just need a hug from time to time. Or I would just love to have real conversation with you. Yeah, for maybe 20 minutes a day as a couple. That we actually talk about real things and hang out and we connect with each other. I would just like that. It's not 2 hours, it's just 20 minutes. That's what it is. So when you communicate the scale of the need for help and support and uh, communications that help you feel special and secure, if you communicate that and you're really clear about when enough is enough, usually in my experience, the other person is relieved. Okay, is that all it is? I can do that. And then most of the time they start delivering the goods. And then when they do, this part's extremely important, make sure you internalize it. People in a romantic relationship are often, especially in the beginning, quite open to requests. But if it feels, on the other hand, that they're pouring their energy into a bottomless pit and that the other person is not doing the work to internalize the experience, so they kind of are less and less hungry for it. If you're with someone who's not doing that, after a while, you kind of, you might want to give up and, seek somebody else who's more emotionally self-sufficient.
Yeah, I think that's really deep, Dad. To take this maybe in a direction that could feel a little bit more superficial, but I hope speak to aspects of the question. There are different desires for intimacy and autonomy in different people. And that's all really okay. And every person needs to have a little bit of both, in my opinion. In other words, in order to be a good relationship partner. If you are totally in intimacy and you have no ability to be autonomous, that person is not a very good relationship partner. If you are totally autonomous and you have no ability to be intimate, that person is not a very good relationship partner. So everybody needs a little bit of both. But how you decide to prioritize those two variables inside of your relationship is really up to you. I think that there's a point at which you can be unhealthy either way, but there are some couples who love each other completely and have been together for 50 years. And most of their intimate interaction with each other is sitting on the same couch doing crossword puzzles next to each other. And that feels really great to them. Then
Yeah,
you could imagine something, if that's on like the 90% autonomy side of the spectrum, then you could imagine something that's on the 90% intimacy side of the spectrum, whatever the opposite of that is, right? There's a lot of deep hand holding and eye gazing every night, but
that's
that
right.
feels really good to those people.
Yep.
And what I just want to say here is that like both of those things are okay. Um, the question here is less about like the optimal balance of intimacy and autonomy in a relationship, and more about, are these issues being well talked about, well communicated, and being funneled in relatively healthy ways inside of your relationship. And that's really up to y'all, like that's up to you. It's very hard for us to kind of offer commentary on that in a way that I think would be helpful for somebody. But I think that sometimes the bar has moved so far in the direction of establish healthy boundaries and really avoid codependency and enmeshment, and have your autonomy and meet your own needs and all of that. Like the pendulum has swung so far that way
It's
that
true.
sometimes it can be helpful to kind of remind ourselves, actually a very intimate, emotionally engaged relationship is a totally okay, psychologically healthy thing if it's funneled in a safe and healthy setting, in a safe and healthy environment. And if you guys like it, like that's really what's important here. Does that kind of make sense, Dad?
Oh, 100% sense.
Yeah.
I'm thinking first that for the partner who has had issues with codependency in the past,
Mm-hmm.
finding out from them, how can you be in such a way that they can give you what you need? And there's this classic question, two-parter, what do you want from me? And then, and this is what I want from you. What could I give you so that you would give me what I want? And I don't mean that
Yeah.
in some kind of twisting arm way. I mean, essentially, how could I? So here I have, so let's say I'm
How
in a
can I
relationship.
support you in
Yeah.
meeting my needs in a way?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
totally.
If I'm in a relationship with someone who definitely has kind of a caution about anything that smells like emotional caretaking on their part, how can I communicate my normal range desires for healthy narcissistic supplies, for praise, for prizing, for cherishing, for acknowledgement, for over demonstrations of love. Okay. What can I give you, my wonderful partner who came out of a codependent kind of relationship? What can I give you so that you're going to realize that this is all healthy and fine and not some kind of problematic emotional caretaking? What can I give to you? That's a really useful thing to negotiate and apply to all kinds of other things.
Mm-hmm.
What can I give to you as a co-parent so that you will come closer to my style of parenting the kids, or what would work for you in terms of both of us ending
How
up
can we
and
meet in
sharing
the
the
middle
load
here?
fairly?
Yeah, totally.
All that. Point one. Point two, having expressed a certain, I don't know, toughness, let's say, about making sure that we, take care of our own needs over here to some extent, and be attentive about not putting demands on another person that they just don't want to meet. All that said, in real relationships, we need to be able to speak from the heart. We need to be able to say, when I shared with you this win I had at work today, and you just kind of nodded and grunted and then changed the topic, I felt deflated because I longed for, I think as many people would, some acknowledgement from you or some celebrating of that win I experienced, some sense of joining with those at work who saw the good in me. Like I would wish for that from you. And when that normal wish was unfulfilled, I felt deflated, for example. And so I think it's important to be able to speak from the heart and talk about what we really long for in our relationships. Otherwise, they become very superficial. They maybe go down to the middle level of depth, but they don't tend to get down to the deep level, which is important to get down to in a good long relationship.
Something I just want to toss in here at the end that is somewhat related to this question, but it was also just a thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently, is something that can happen in relationships is that our partner expresses something to us that they want. And then we think to ourselves about how we would want that need to be met if it were us. Like the other person says to us, I need more emotional nurturance from you, or I want you to help me with my issues around emotional nurturance, or my issues maybe here around autonomy. And we think about, oh, they want that kind of a thing. And if I wanted that kind of a thing, this is what I would want. And then we give that thing to them. And then they say, well, that's cool and all, but that's not actually what I want. I want you to support my desires for more emotional nurturance. And we go back to the drawing board and we think, okay, like, all right, maybe I missed it that time, but this time I'm really going to give them what would feel great. And then we miss again because we've never actually figured out what that means to them.
Yep.
And a lot of the time in relationships, we have these translational issues that happen where a word means one thing to one person and a very different thing to another person. Inside of my relationship with Elizabeth, I receive care from her when she does basic tasks like doing the dishes or taking out the trash or things like that. I feel very cared for when she does those little things, even cared for emotionally, because I know that she knows that those things are important to me. And so it's like, oh, I see this person contributing in a way that feels good to me. There are a lot of other ways I could receive emotional nurturance. Some of those ways actually wouldn't be as meaningful to me as just like helping with those basic tasks. So kind of figuring out where you're both at with those terms and making sure that you're on the same page about what these words mean can be actually a super helpful part of the process.
Extremely helpful, particularly if there are conflicts. If everything's going fine and people are kind of doing this kabuki dance around each other where they're not really ever naming anything, but everybody's getting what they need.
But it's all working out. Yeah.
That's great. But otherwise, clarity is often better.
Awesome. Well, let's move on to the next one here, Dad. So, question number 4. I feel like I constantly seek approval and validation from other people. How can I heal from that tendency?
Well, I very much relate to this question personally. And I can say a little bit of my own journey is that the most important step was to actually internalize the approval and validation I did receive. And in fact, as appropriate, ask for it, and also take actions that would naturally elicit approval and validation through accomplishing good things and being of good use to other people. So that for me was the primary pathway. And to step out of the background of shaming yourself, there's a kind of a view these days a lot like, oh, don't be so needy, or, how come you always need so much praise? I lambasted myself for that. And then I realized, wait a second here, as social primates, we absolutely needed to know that we were in good standing with the other people in our hunter-gatherer band, because otherwise it could be a huge threat to our own survival. If they didn't like us and think we're special and go out of their way for us, we don't have that relationship with other people. Whoa, we're in a world of hurt. So it's normal to want approval and validation, especially if, as would be my hunch here and was true for me, there wasn't sufficient internalization of approval and validation when you were younger. So primary way to heal from it is to really take it in. Another thing related to that, though, is that even alongside the taking it in, it's really helpful, and this too has been important for me, to become more and more disenchanted about approval, acclaim, hand claps from other people. I often remember this comment from a driver in Chicago who would drive around the famous authors who were doing book tours in the city. And when he was asked what he had learned from all of that, he said, pursue excellence, ignore fame. And in our culture that's obsessed with celebrity and fame, and as you put it, Forrest, other people's highlight reels on their Instagram stories or Facebook, contrasting to our warts and all complete documentary that we're aware of our own lives, it's really easy to feel like, oh, I need to go get the brass ring. I need more approval. I want to impress people. I need to be more accepted and brought up by the cool kids, in my life today. Uh, do what you can to get reasonable approval and validation. But if you can also really see that when you get it, how good does it really feel? How long does it last? And what else is important to you in life?
The big picture of this question is about intrinsic versus extrinsic sources of validation, right? That's the big picture. And
Yeah.
the kind of meta part of it that I wonder about is self-worth, because the less internally referenced we are and the less worthy we feel from the inside out, the more we need validation of that from external sources. That's kind of how it works, right? We have to fill ourselves up with something. If it's not being internally generated, we need more of those external sources of it. So we've done a lot of content at times in the past, including a number of episodes focused on self-worth that are really dedicated to that. So if this is something that you're interested in, I would go and check those things out. And I think that the movement of this internally, from thinking about it as I seek too much validation, to thinking about it in terms of it would be valuable for me to develop a stronger sense of self-worth or self-appreciation, self-efficacy, that shift in how you frame the question, I think could be very useful for a person. And versions of that have been very useful for me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I do want to mention an observation, at least in my everyday American California culture. Many, many people are really poor at positive feedback. They just don't step into opportunities to acknowledge other people. And if that other person has just hit a home run, they've just done something hard, they've dealt with a tough situation, they've said something really funny or wise, and then to have no response from the room, it's just strange. So realize, unfortunately, that many people are just generically poor at approval and validation. Sometimes they need you to ask for it explicitly, but be realistic about what you're likely really to get. And flip the other way, be that person who steps into situations appreciatively. I think there's a term, appreciative inquiry, where you're really looking for what's good, what's interesting, what's valuable, and you're exploring that together with another person.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to leave this one. As with all of these questions, they touch on topics that we've spent a lot more time talking about, and we could certainly spend a lot more time here. But in the interest of time, let's move along to the final question today. My life has been shaped by a very difficult relationship with my mother. I'm 60, and I've been to therapy for a long time. But whenever I'm around her, I fall back into being a reactive teenage girl. Her constant devaluations had a devastating impact on my self worth, and I told her that I needed a break. But this just made me feel like she was right, that there's something wrong with me, and I'm not a good person because I wasn't able to be my best self around her. Can you speak to that? I feel like I'm failing.
Part that There are a couple parts that stand out for me. One is the feeling of failing, which seems to be related to needing to take a step back from the mother. And so with the idea being that the something that is wrong with me is that I can't see my mom, who's probably in her 80s, as a sweet person, maybe with a critical streak, and just says impulsively dumb things. And gee, why can't I just suck it up and be a grown up and be okay with that?
Yeah. And so you're speaking from maybe their internal voice, a lot of self judgment, a lot of criticism. Yeah.
That's right. And the reason the person, can't be around my mother is that I'm still triggered. I'm still reactivated by that old material when I'm around her. There's a real question, of course, is the mother continuing to be devaluing? Uh, or is that in the past? It's unclear in the question.
The original question was a little longer and had a little bit more detail. Sometimes I cut these down just for the
Yeah.
usefulness on a podcast format like ours. And in the question, it was pretty clear that this was an ongoing behavior.
Yep.
There had been a lot of attempts to change it, and it just hadn't changed. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what I think. So on the one hand, I think that, and we did a episode on estrangement. Sometimes with an aging parent, after you've made all the efforts in the world you can that are reasonable to get them to change, and they're just not willing to take responsibility for their part and they're not willing to budge, sometimes you make a fateful choice to take a big step back. My own view of the ethics here is that the impact of that big step back by an adult child on their aging parent can be really devastating. It's the nuclear option, and it's one to use judiciously. And you get to decide, whoever you are, what's judicious, what's fair, what's reasonable, what's the best way to be. Okay. So on the one hand, there's a place for just realizing, I'm going to reduce my contact with you. As I put it in a chapter in my book, Making Great Relationships, I'm going to resize the relationship. So our visits are going to be shorter. They might occur earlier in the day. As soon as you say anything critical of me, I'm going to just tell you it was nice seeing you, Mom, and I'm leaving now. And there's going to be a longer interval before I'm back to visit you wherever you live. There are consequences. So there's resizing on the one hand. On the other hand, if that reactive teenage girl material had been entirely processed, then potentially the person asking the question could be around the still critical mother and not be reactivated by it in a way that is turbocharged and maybe distorted by that teenage girl material. Then the question becomes, what's possible there? Those reactions to mother, went in deep when you were young and vulnerable, and they were repeated, and your mom was intense and all the rest of that. Okay. But still, maybe there's some opportunity to get a fuller release of that material. And I would just kind of wonder about that. Is there a deeper level to inquire into? Is there a tip of the root to get at deeper down? Are there reparative experiences with your mother, maybe ways in which a lovingness for you lives alongside her criticality? Could those reparative experiences with her be linked Two, that young teenage girl material, so you bring them into contact with that. Could you have reparative experiences with other people besides your mother who see the best in you and are not critical of you? Could you bring those experiences into contact with that sense inside of being devalued as a girl, et cetera, so that you're less reactive around her? So I can see it going both ways. Help yourself to be less reactive around her. Second, feel entitled to take a step back. It's not you're not failing. You're just making a choice to step away from someone who's mistreating you and has been told 100 times to cut it out, and they keep doing it. I think we have some duties to our aging parents, but they're not infinite. And our aging parents are adults, and they have some responsibility for their conduct.
Yeah,
It's messy, isn't it?
it is. And on the other hand, I think it's really simple at the same time. My honest view about it is it sounds like you've put a lot of effort in and she hasn't. Bottom line.
Yeah.
Sounds like you've put a ton of effort in and your mom's kind of still doing her bad behaving. And look, I think that there is a lot of honor in being a good parent. There's an enormous amount of effort that is spent on a child between the ages of 0 and 18 to get them to, where you hope to send them in life. That is often very thankless work, particularly for moms from your mother's generation. And it's good to acknowledge and appreciate all of that. And at the same time, that does not entitle somebody to you as an adult. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
Does not entitle them to you. Does not entitle them to treat you poorly. Does not entitle them to your time and effort. Does not entitle them to your caring. You do not have to reciprocate to your mother the kind of care that she gave you when you were a 4-year-old. Like there's not an inversion of this relationship that needs to happen now that your parent is aging. And I think a lot of the time we put kind of false pressure on people to reciprocate that inversion. But the bottom line is that they opted into having you as a kid. You did not opt into having them as a parent.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fundamental imbalance of power that I think is really important to name here. And so if you feel that you have raised these issues repeatedly, you have not been heard in the raising of them, the behavior has perpetuated, you have attempted to improve things and you've just been totally stymied in the attempt to improve them. I'm just like, yeah, man, you're within your rights to do whatever you want. If you want to get out of there, get out of there. If you want to take some space, take some space. And so I would really just validate that part of your experience quite strongly. Because it feels like that's the part of the experience that's really bringing you this feeling that I suspect is like very much in your mother's voice inside of you that is devaluing and making you continue to feel wrong. So there's very much that side of it. And also at the same time, I think everything you said was totally right, Dad. That like, if there's material here that is being activated, that's coming into the room, those younger parts, that there's still the suggestion inside of you that there's some more work to do there or some work that you could potentially do with your mom's support or that your mom might still be interested in doing. If that work's still there to do, then phenomenal. But I suspect that work has been attempted probably many times. And you've kind of done what's there to do at this point. That's my general sense of it. And at that point, man, I think that it's really about harm reduction. It's really about figuring out how you can make this as okay as possible for you. Whatever that means. If that means stepping back into the room with her because that's what helps you feel better about yourself, then amazing. And if that means, hey, taking a step back and taking some time, then that makes total sense as well.
Very, very wise, Forrest. This person and others might be interested in this self-worth workshop that I just did, a lot of which has to do with these topics. And one part of it comes to my mind here in that for the person asking the question, what are your own noble purposes here that are
That's really good, Dad. I really like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that are authentic to you, your purposes. Now, she might have her agendas, and it might be that there are shoulds or standards that you internalized or related to her being so critical when you were growing up. But those are not your own noble purposes. Those are other people's purposes. And you can decide whether you want to take some or all of them or none of them. So you identify your own purposes. How do I want to be? What are my values? What are the currents from the inside out, from the bottom up, that I want to open to as they live through me, manifesting and offering into the world in that way, in which I take refuge myself. I feel at peace as I'm lived by these purposes. I know that I'm fulfilling them. So this is how I'm judging myself. I'm judging myself in reference to my own noble purposes. And there's a place for judging ourselves. We're discerning how close we're coming to them. But if you are living in this good way, give yourself credit for it and take refuge in that and be relieved, find reassurance. So, for example, you might say, well, one of my noble purposes is I am going to stay in touch with my love for that part in my mother behind her annoying and critical personality, constructed by her life history and all the stuff she went through and her parents went through. Okay, I'm going to see past that and I'm going to rest in a fundamental lovingness toward her. Another noble purpose is compassion. I'm going to be aware of how things are hard for my mom. She's suffering, she's aging, she's looking at the end of the ride. I can have compassion for her, and I'm resting that. That could be a noble purpose. Another noble purpose is I'm not going to be an asshole. I may want to be, but I'm just not going
It's a
to
good
act
noble
it out.
purpose right there. Love that.
Yeah, don't be an asshole. I'm not going to yell at her. I'm not going to dump shit on her that she can't do anything about at this advanced age. And frankly, she has no capacity for repair. I'm not going to be a jerk. Okay, so I'm in touch with these noble purposes, and I'm judging myself accordingly. I'm going to be an advocate for her with her healthcare system. I'm going to run interference with her doctors. I'm going to prod the doctors to do better by her if I think there's a problem there. I'm going to do those things. I'm going to fulfill my duties to her. In that context, then, it's also clear to me that I do not have to take any crap from her. And I'm too old for that crap. I'm 60. Enough already. I don't need that stuff. And especially from somebody that I'm living in noble purpose with regard to. So then the two go together. It's a lot easier to set calm, clear, wise boundaries when you're already rested in and clear about the noble purposes that you're fulfilling.
Great place to close this one here, Dad, I think, because
good.
that's a really good way to summarize a lot of this, and particularly a great way to summarize what the person actually has control over. What you do not have control over your mom's behavior end of the day. And you might wish for a different kind of relationship with your mother, but that's a wish. You cannot control the realization of that wish. But what you can really control is exactly what you just said, Dad, which is thinking about what really matters to you at this point in the journey and what's going to help you feel good about this, frankly, for the rest of your life. Like, what are you going to regret? What are you not going to regret? What are you going to wish you had said? All those pieces of it, I just think are a huge piece of the puzzle. So really great place to close this.
Yeah, great.
Well, I really enjoyed this one, Dad. Thanks for taking the time today to answer all of these questions from our listeners. I thought this was really rich.
One thing I really like about this is that it takes general principles out of the clouds and brings them back to earth, down to earth in the real lives of real people.
I really enjoyed answering some questions from our listeners today. We started with a question about dealing with a friend, and in this case, a coworker, who is chronically negative. I thought this one was really interesting because this is a really common problem that people deal with. And I loved how Rick highlighted the importance sometimes of going down a level. It is so easy to exist on a surface level with other people, but we can deepen the relationships that we have by trying to ask the next follow-up question that might be popping into our head. Then the question, of course, is like, how do we ask that in a skillful way? But rather than existing just on a level with the person where you're unpacking the material, maybe you're complaining about them being negative, maybe you're telling them to, just either get used to it or just be happier about it, or why do you have to be so negative all the time? You can do a little bit of inquiry around, why do you feel that way? Oh, what would it be like to get more of what you actually wanted? What would a version of this thing be that you actually enjoyed? What's going on for you these days that is maybe causing you to feel how you feel? And those kinds of possibilities can circumvent the sort of false dichotomy that we create some of the time between just going with another person's behavior and actively pushing against it. We can actually join with their behavior in order to move it to a slightly different track, not because we're trying to control how they are, but because we're authentically interested in what's going on inside of them. Second question was really interesting. It came from somebody who was in their mid to late 20s and hadn't been in a romantic relationship and had noticed some patterns in their lives around avoidance, how they were avoiding intimacy in a bunch of different ways. And they were trying to figure out what they could do about that. I really know this from a lot of painful personal experience here. Physical sensation is a great way into deeper emotional experiences. And if you're able to develop a greater sense of interoception, you can often work with some of the emotions that will start boiling up more effectively. It's really normal for people who have avoided emotions for a long period of time to actually have a lot of emotion down there that's kind of bottled up and boiling away. And there can be some fear around taking the lid off of that emotion and some concern about whether or not all of it's just going to bubble up in this kind of uncontrolled manner. So it's really helpful to remind yourself that you are an extremely well regulated person. If you have this set of issues, this more cognitive bypassing set of issues, man, you are going to be pretty darn good at controlling your emotions if you need to. So you just don't really have to worry about that so much. You are not somebody who has historically struggled with unregulated emotions pouring out of you in all directions. And so if you need that suit of armor, don't worry, it is still there waiting for you in the closet. And I added on at the end a little bit about becoming aware of where in the process the avoidance is kicking in. Is it kicking in at the very top of the funnel where you're not even going out and meeting people? Or is it more a problem that comes up later in the process when you're getting into deeper levels of emotional intimacy with somebody else? Because that can really tell us a lot about why it is that we're struggling. Third question, the person asked about codependency and enmeshment, particularly being in a relationship with somebody who's had some enmeshment issues in the past and trying to establish healthy boundaries inside of that relationship, which also includes asking for what you need and wanting support, but without falling into the habit of being excessively emotionally reliant on other people. And Rick highlighted how for people who struggle with codependency, they tend to become codependent if given an opportunity. It becomes really important for them to internalize the authentic experiences that they do have of being nurtured, supported, seen, heard by other people, particularly by the people that they care about. Because there are two possibilities here. It could be that the bucket is not having enough water be put into it, and that's why the bucket is empty. The other possibility is that there's a hole in the bottom of the bucket. And it doesn't matter how much water you put into it, it just keeps on flowing through. Both of those things can be real problems in a relationship, but they are distinctly different problems. And it's really helpful to identify, is this about the inputs that I'm receiving, or is this more that no amount of nurturance is enough for me because there's some problem in how I'm either internalizing that nurturance or some other issue that's going on with how I'm relating to others or supporting myself. Because the truth is that in every relationship, yes, we need other people to help us meet our needs. We have become a kind of pathologically self reliant culture. And I think that it's really great that there's such an emphasis on boundaries and healthy relating and autonomy. We talk about autonomy all the time on the podcast. I am captain agency over here. And we're also fundamentally dependent beings. There are things that we can only get from other people. And we need to get real about that and get real about whether or not the person that we've chosen to be in a relationship with is capable of providing those things to us. It's all well and good to enter a relationship with the hope and the belief that other people will change. And the truth is that they will change, but they're not always going to change in the ways that you want them to. So, a really important question to ask yourself is, hey, if this person stayed just as they are, would I still want to be with them? The fourth question was about chronically seeking approval and validation from other people. Both Rick and I really focused in on the self-worth aspect of this question. What can a person do to become more internally referenced, more sturdy from the inside out, and less externally referenced or dependent on the views and beliefs of other people for their self-worth? This, again, is a situation where taking in those real experiences of support and validation is an extremely important part of the process. Many people actually have many experiences in their day-to-day life of being supported and seen and validated by other people. They just don't recognize that it's happening as it's happening. All of these little tiny moments, they're not million-dollar moments, they're not big deals, but they are real, they do exist. Do you actually take a moment to really feel them and to really let them impact how you think about yourself? And then, independent of that, What are you doing to feel better about yourself from the inside out so you need less input from the outside in? We closed the conversation with a question that was about taking some space from an aging parent, and particularly an aging parent who had been chronically devaluing of the person who asked the question. They felt that the fact that they had to take some space meant that there was something wrong with them and their parent really was right this whole time. Bottom line, if you've made a lot of efforts to make it work with somebody else, whether they're your parent or your child or your partner or your friend or whoever, you've put in effort after effort after effort. You have done the work. You have looked at your part. You have been dedicated and deliberate and interested in making it happen. You've been willing to compromise. Maybe you've even really tried to change in the ways that they wanted you to change, and just nothing is ever enough. There is a point at which it is very reasonable to look out for yourself here. Yes, sometimes we do have obligations to other people. And yes, we do need to be conscious of the ways in which making that choice to take some space from somebody else is going to impact them. I think that that's part of being a moral person in the world. We want to think about those things. But ultimately, it's your life. And that's why I think it's so great that Rick closed the episode by focusing on what is really your sense of moral purpose here. What would be a really great outcome for you? What would feel good? What would help you feel good about your behavior? And operating from that stance can feel so different than operating from a stance either of self-judgment and self-recrimination, or from this position where you feel like you're just constantly besieged by what this person is saying about you. You can just return over and over again to that fundamental question, like, what is my purpose here? What am I trying to accomplish? And can I feel good about doing that, even if it's imperfect? I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I had a really good time answering these questions. Again, if you would like a question answered on the podcast, you can find us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. And you can also send me an email if you would like to have a question answered that way. It's contact@beingwellpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Have a great week.